You're nothing but a gold digger with a worthless degree. Our son deserves better than you." Those were the final words my mother-in-law hurled at me before I walked out of their Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, leaving behind my half-eaten pumpkin pie and my marriage. Yesterday, she called me sobbing, desperately needing $300,000 to save their family business. Money only I could provide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The certified letter sat unopened on my kitchen counter for 2 days. The return address belonged to Whitfield Associates, my former in-law's family law firm. Just seeing that embossed letterhead brought back a flood of memories I'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. 3 years of rebuilding my life. 3 years of finally discovering who Olivia Parker truly was without Richard and his overbearing family casting shadows over every choice I made. I poured myself another cup of coffee, my third that morning, and finally picked up the envelope. My hands weren't exactly steady as I broke the seal and removed the contents. Inside was a formal letter requesting a meeting regarding urgent financial matters pertaining to the Whitfield family interests. The document was signed by Eleanor Whitfield herself, Richard's mother, the same woman who had systematically undermined my confidence throughout my 5-year marriage to her son. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of belittling my career, choices, mocking my middle-class upbringing, and questioning why her precious son had settled for someone so ordinary, Eleanor Whitfield was now reaching out for help. I should have felt vindication, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, I felt a complex tangle of emotions that no Instagram quote about karma could adequately capture. I carried my coffee to the window of my downtown apartment, looking out at the city I now called home. After the divorce, I'd left our suburban house and the suffocating social circle that came with being a Whitfield bride. I'd moved 200 miles away to start fresh, taking nothing but my clothes, my books, and the education Eleanor had so frequently dismissed as impractical. My literature degree and teaching credential had proven far more valuable than she'd predicted. 3 years after our separation, I'd published 2 successful young adult novels, built a respected educational consulting business, and recently signed a development deal for a streaming adaptation of my book series. The Impractical Dreamer was now financially independent in ways that would have shocked the Whitfields. But they didn't know any of this. After the divorce, I'd cut all contact with Richard and his family. Our communication had been strictly through attorneys, and I'd made a point of keeping my professional success away from social media and out of circles where news might get back to them. It wasn't about hiding. It was about healing without the weight of their judgment. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. The screen displayed my sister Megan's name. "Have you opened it?" she asked immediately. I'd texted her a photo of the envelope when it arrived. "Just did. They want a meeting." "About what?" "Financial matters, apparently. That's all it says." "Are you going to go?" Megan had witnessed firsthand the emotional toll my marriage had taken. She'd been the one who drove to the Whitfields after I'd called her in tears that Thanksgiving night. "I don't know," I admitted, tracing the embossed letterhead with my fingertip. "Part of me wants to ignore it completely. And the other part," I sighed, "is curious. And maybe wants them to see that I didn't fall apart without them." "That's human," Megan reassured me. "Just remember, you don't owe them anything. Not your time, not your money, and definitely not your peace." After hanging up, I sent a brief email to the address provided in the letter, agreeing to a meeting the following week. I specified a coffee shop near my office rather than the suggested location of the Whitfield law firm. If this conversation was going to happen, it would be on neutral ground and on my terms. For the next 5 days, I threw myself into work, finalizing a curriculum guide for educators, using my books in classrooms, and reviewing production notes for the upcoming adaptation. but thoughts of the impending meeting lingered in the background, like static on an old radio, impossible to completely tune out. When Thursday arrived, I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress that projected quiet confidence. No designer labels or flashy accessories, nothing that suggested I was trying to impress. Just a successful professional keeping a business appointment. The coffee shop was busy with the morning rush when I arrived. I spotted Eleanor immediately, sitting alone at a corner table. At 63, she still maintained the polished appearance of old money, perfectly colored blonde hair, understated jewelry, and that particular posture that spoke of private schools and country clubs. But something was different. The usual armor of superiority seemed tarnished somehow. There were new lines around her eyes, and her customary Hermes scarf was noticeably absent. "Olivia," she said, standing as I approached. She extended her hand formally, as though we were business acquaintances rather than former family. "Thank you for coming." "Eleanor," I replied, accepting her handshake briefly before taking a seat. "Your letter mentioned urgent financial matters." No small talk, no pretense of warm reunion. I wasn't going to make this easier for her. Eleanor took a sip of her tea before responding. "Yes, I'll be direct. The Whitfield Group is in trouble. Serious trouble." The Whitfield Group was the family's business conglomerate, a collection of real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and the law firm that had been in Richard's family for 3 generations. Richard had been next in line to take over before. Our divorce threw his carefully plotted life trajectory off course. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'm not sure what this has to do with me." Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her teacup. "We need liquid capital immediately. The pandemic hit our commercial real estate holdings particularly hard. Then Peter made some unwise investments trying to recoup the losses. Peter Whitfield, Richard's father, had always prided himself on his business acumen. The admission that he had misstepped financially seemed to physically pain Eleanor. "Again, I'm not sure what this has to do with me," I repeated, though I was beginning to see where this conversation was heading. "Richard mentioned that your books have been successful." The way she said books made it sound like I'd been publishing something scandalous rather than award-winning young adult literature. "They've done well," I confirmed, offering nothing more. "We need $300,000 to prevent foreclosure on several key properties. It would be a loan, of course, with interest." The request hung in the air between us. $300,000. The amount was substantial, but not impossible for me now. The advance for my 3rd book alone had been more than that, but the audacity of the request after everything that had happened left me momentarily speechless. "Have you approached a bank?" I finally asked. "Our credit lines are exhausted. The collateral we could offer is already leveraged." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but I could detect the desperation beneath her composed exterior. "Where's Richard in all this? Surely your son could help." A flicker of something, pain perhaps, or embarrassment, crossed Eleanor's face. "Richard is not in a position to assist at present. He's going through some personal difficulties." I nodded, unsurprised. Richard had always been dependent on his family's wealth and connections. When problems arose, he looked to his parents for solutions rather than developing his own resilience. "Eleanor," I said carefully, "you called me worthless at your Thanksgiving table 3 years ago. You said my career aspirations were childish fantasies. You told your son he was making the biggest mistake of his life by staying with me." And I kept my voice level, stating facts rather than expressing anger. "Now you're asking me for financial help?" For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Eleanor Whitfield looked genuinely uncomfortable. "People say things in the heat of the moment, Olivia. Family tensions can—" "It wasn't the heat of the moment," I interrupted. "It was consistent behavior throughout my entire marriage to your son." Eleanor straightened in her chair, some of her old haughtiness returning. "If you're looking for an apology—" "I'm not," I said simply. "I moved past needing your approval or apology a long time ago. I'm just trying to understand why you would come to me of all people for help." "Because we have nowhere else to turn," she admitted, the words seeming to cost her dearly. "And despite everything, you were family once." I studied her face, searching for manipulation or calculation. What I saw instead surprised me, genuine fear. Eleanor Whitfield was afraid of losing everything, and that fear had driven her to do the one thing I never thought possible: humble herself enough to ask for my help. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "I'll let you know my decision in a few days." Relief flickered across her features. "Thank you for considering it," she said, reaching into her purse and extracting a business card. "My personal number is on the back." As I stood to leave, she added, "Richard doesn't know I've contacted you. He wouldn't approve of me reaching out." That sounded like the proud, stubborn man I'd married. Even in financial ruin, Richard would be too proud to seek help from the woman he'd discarded. I left the coffee shop and walked several blocks before calling Megan. "They need money," I told her without preamble when she answered. $300,000. "You're kidding me," Megan gasped. "The almighty Whitfields are asking you for a handout? That's unbelievable." "To prevent foreclosure on some properties." "Tell me you said no." I said I'd think about it. "Olivia," my sister's voice rose in disbelief. "After everything they put you through, the way they treated you, the things they said?" No, I sighed, stopping at a crosswalk. "But it's complicated."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"No, it's not. They made your life miserable. They belittled your dreams. They treated you like you were beneath them. And now that they need something, suddenly you're worth talking to?" Megan's outrage was justified. She'd seen me at my lowest after leaving the Whitfields, struggling to rebuild my sense of self-worth amid the wreckage of a marriage where I'd been constantly made to feel inadequate. "I'm not saying I'll give them the money," I clarified. "I just need to think through what I want to do here." Later that evening, I sat in my home office, staring at the vision board I'd created after my divorce. It was covered with publishing goals, travel dreams, and quotes about personal growth, many of which I'd already achieved. In the center was a note I'd written to myself during those dark days. "Your worth is not determined by their perception." It had become my mantra as I rebuilt my life, a reminder that the Whitfields' assessment of my value had been wrong at every turn. The impractical writing career had brought me financial security and creative fulfillment. The teaching background they'd dismissed had opened doors to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities. The empathy they'd perceived as weakness had connected me with readers around the world. I opened my laptop and pulled up my banking information. The numbers on the screen represented not just financial security, but vindication. Proof that following my own path rather than conforming to the Whitfields' expectations had been the right choice. The question wasn't whether I could afford to help them. I could. The question was whether I should, and what that decision would mean for my own healing journey. I reached for my phone and called the one person whose perspective I trusted implicitly. "Professor Martinez? It's Olivia Parker. I'm sorry to call so late, but I could use some advice." Carmen Martinez had been my literature professor in college and had become a mentor and friend in the years since. She'd encouraged my writing when everyone else suggested more practical pursuits, and she'd been the first person to read the manuscript that eventually became my debut novel. "Olivia, never apologize for calling. What's on your mind?" I explained the situation in detail, the history with the Whitfields, their current financial troubles, and my mixed feelings about helping them. "That is quite the moral dilemma," Carmen acknowledged when I'd finished. "What's your instinct telling you?" "That's the problem. My instincts are conflicted." Part of me wants to say no on principle. They were terrible to me, and now they're facing the consequences of their own choices. Why should I bail them out? And the other part? I hesitated, trying to articulate the complex emotions swirling beneath my initial reaction. The other part wonders if helping them might be the final step in my own healing. Not for their sake, but for mine. To prove to myself that I'm not defined by their treatment of me, that I can make decisions based on my values rather than in reaction to their behavior. There's wisdom in that perspective, Carmen said thoughtfully. Sometimes the most powerful response to those who hurt us isn't revenge or even indifference, but compassion from a position of strength. But I don't want to be manipulated either, I admitted. Eleanor didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the harm they caused. She just needs something from me now. Then perhaps the question isn't a simple yes or no to their request. Perhaps it's about finding a third option that honors your boundaries while still allowing you to act from your values. After speaking with Carmen, I spent the weekend weighing my options and formulating a plan. By Monday morning, I had made my decision. I texted Eleanor asking to meet again, this time at my publisher's office downtown. When she arrived, I could see she was taken aback by the sleek, modern space with its wall of awards and framed book covers, several of which bore my name. Good. I wanted her to see tangible evidence of the success she had once deemed impossible. "Thank you for meeting me again," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. The power dynamic had shifted noticeably from our coffee shop meeting. There, she had chosen the position of authority. Here, in my professional space, I was clearly in control. "Have you made a decision?" Eleanor asked, her usual social graces thin over her anxiety. "I have," I confirmed. "I'm not going to give you the money as a loan." Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I understand. It was presumptuous to ask, given our history." "I'm not finished," I continued. "I won't give you a loan, but I am prepared to help the Whitfield Group in a different way." Her expression shifted from resignation to cautious interest. "I've consulted with my financial advisor, and I'm willing to purchase one of your commercial properties outright, specifically the Riverside Building." The Riverside Building was one of the Whitfield Group's most promising assets, a historic structure in the Arts District that had been partially renovated before the pandemic halted their plans. It was also, I knew from my married days, Eleanor's favorite project. She had been personally involved in the design choices, envisioning it as a showcase property that would cement the family's legacy in the city's cultural landscape. "The Riverside property isn't officially on the market," Eleanor said carefully. "No, but it's one of the properties facing foreclosure, according to your loan documents." I placed a folder on the desk between us. "I've had my team review the financials you provided. The purchase price would be sufficient to resolve your immediate cash flow issues and prevent the other foreclosures. In exchange, I get a property with significant potential that aligns with my future business goals." Eleanor opened the folder, reviewing the proposed purchase agreement inside. "This is a fair market offer," she acknowledged, sounding surprised. "I don't need to take advantage of your situation to feel better about myself," I said simply. "But I do have conditions beyond the purchase price." Eleanor looked up, wariness returning to her expression. "What conditions?" "First, the upper floor of the building will be developed into a community literacy center bearing my grandmother's name. She was a public school teacher for 40 years in the same neighborhood where your family owns multiple properties but has invested very little in community resources. My grandmother had been my first champion, sneaking me extra books from her classroom and encouraging my writing long before anyone else saw its value. She had also been the subject of thinly veiled condescension from Eleanor during our few family gatherings, dismissed as quaint and simple because of her working-class background and modest lifestyle. Second, I continued, the Whitfield Group will match my annual donation to the city's education foundation for the next 5 years. The amount is specified in the agreement, It's substantial, but not prohibitive once your financial situation stabilizes." Eleanor was silent, processing these terms. "And third," I said, my voice softening slightly, "you will personally write a letter to be framed in the Literacy Center, explaining why supporting educational opportunities for all children matters, regardless of their background or family connections. It doesn't need to mention me or reference our history, but it does need to be sincere." This last condition wasn't about public humiliation or forcing an apology. It was about transformation, offering Eleanor the opportunity to contribute, something meaningful beyond her usual social circles, and perhaps in the process, expand her understanding of value beyond the narrow definitions that had poisoned our relationship. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked after a long moment. "You could simply refuse to help. After the things I said, the way we treated you, no one would blame you." It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the weekend. "I'm not doing it for you," I answered honestly. "I'm doing it because the person I've become since leaving your family values education, community investment, and breaking cycles of elitism. This solution serves my goals while addressing your crisis. It's a business decision that happens to align with my personal values." The truth was more nuanced than I could explain across a desk to a woman who had never truly seen me. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about claiming my power to reshape a painful history into something constructive, transforming the Whitfield legacy of exclusion into a Parker legacy of access and opportunity. Eleanor studied me with new eyes, perhaps truly seeing me for the first time. "You've changed," she observed. "No," I corrected her. "I'm exactly who I always was. You just never bothered to look beyond your preconceptions to see it." After a moment's consideration, Eleanor picked up the pen I'd placed beside the agreement. "The board will need to review this, but as majority shareholders, Peter and I can push it through." She signed her name on the preliminary document, then looked up at me. "Richard will have to be told. He still holds shares in the company." "That's your concern, not mine," I replied. "My attorneys will handle all communication regarding the transaction." As Eleanor prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Olivia, I was wrong about you, at Thanksgiving and all the other times." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Eleanor Whitfield, it was unprecedented. "I know," I said simply. 2 days later, I was reviewing the final edits on my third novel when my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. It was local to the suburb where Richard and I had once lived. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Olivia." The voice was instantly recognizable. Richard, my ex-husband. The man I'd once thought I'd grow old with, before his family's toxicity and his own unwillingness to stand against it had poisoned our relationship beyond repair. "Richard," I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm assuming Eleanor told you about our arrangement." "She did." His voice sounded strange, strained almost. I wanted to talk to you directly. There's nothing to discuss," I said firmly. "The preliminary agreement has been signed. My legal team is handling the details." "This isn't about the agreement," he insisted. "It's about everything else. Can we meet? Please?" The old Olivia would have jumped at this opportunity, eager. For closure, for understanding, maybe even for reconciliation. But I wasn't that person anymore. "I don't think that's necessary," I replied. "Whatever you want to say, you can say over the phone." Richard sighed, a sound so familiar it sent an unexpected pang through me. "I owe you an apology, Liv. A real one. Not the kind my mother gives that's really just another way of asserting superiority." I said nothing, waiting. "I should have defended you," he continued when I didn't respond. At Thanksgiving and all the other times. I let my parents diminish you because it was easier than standing up to them. I always knew, how brilliant you were, how talented. I was proud of you, but I was too weak to say so when it mattered. The words I had once so desperately wanted to hear now arrived too late, landing in a life I had carefully reconstructed without him. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because seeing you succeed, seeing you strong enough to help the family that hurt you, but on your own terms, it made me realize what I lost. Not just a wife, but a partner with more courage and integrity than anyone else I know. Including yourself," I couldn't help adding. "Especially myself," he acknowledged. The candor surprised me. Richard had never been one for harsh self-assessment. "I've changed too," he continued. "After the divorce, I finally got therapy, moved out of my parents' sphere of influence, started making my own decisions for the first time in my life." "That's good for you," I said, meaning it despite the detachment in my tone. "But it doesn't change what happened between us." No, I'm not asking for reconciliation, Olivia. I'm not that delusional. I just wanted you to know that at least one Whitfield recognizes what was lost when we drove you away." There was sincerity in his voice that tugged at old memories. Richard bringing me coffee during late-night writing sessions, defending my career choice to his college friends, celebrating with genuine joy when I sold my first short story. Before his parents' influence had fully taken hold, he had believed in me in ways they never had. "Thank you for saying that," I finally replied. "I hope you find happiness, Richard. I really do." After we hung up, I sat with the conversation, examining how it made me feel. There was a time when hearing Richard's apology would have sent me into an emotional tailspin. Now, it felt like tying off a loose end, closing a chapter that had been left partially unfinished. The next morning, I woke to an email from my agent with news that made Richard's call fade to background noise. My second novel had been nominated for a prestigious literary award, the kind that changed careers and opened doors previously closed. The kind that would be reported in the publishing news outlets that even the Whitfields, with their disdain for impractical creative pursuits, would notice. The timing felt significant, a cosmic punctuation mark on the story of my separation, from their world and emergence into my own. I texted Megan and Professor Martinez the news, then made myself a celebratory breakfast of Belgian waffles with fresh berries, a weekend luxury I now allowed myself on weekday mornings because I made the rules in my life. As I savored each bite, my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the nomination. Well-deserved recognition for extraordinary talent. Peter Whitfield." I stared at the message, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. Richard's father, the patriarch of the Whitfield family, acknowledging my achievement. The man who had once suggested I use my teaching credential as a backup when the writing thing doesn't pan out, was now congratulating me? I set my phone down without responding. Whatever shift was happening in the Whitfield family dynamic, whether from genuine enlightenment or the humbling effect of financial crisis, wasn't my concern. My focus remained on my own path forward. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The property purchase proceeded smoothly, with my legal team handling all interactions with the Whitfield Group. Preliminary designs for the Literacy Center were developed, with input from local educators and community leaders. My editor sent the final manuscript of my third novel for approval, and I began outlining ideas for a potential new series. Through it all, I maintained a professional distance from the Whitfields. Eleanor sent occasional emails with updates on the matched, donations to the Education Foundation, and progress on her promised letter. Richard texted once more, sharing a positive review of my first novel that he'd discovered in a literary journal he'd started reading. I acknowledged these communications briefly, but didn't invite further engagement. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly 3 years after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I received another certified letter from Whitfield Associates. This time, I opened it immediately. Inside was a formal document stating that Eleanor and Peter Whitfield had established a scholarship fund at the state university, dedicated to supporting first-generation college students pursuing degrees in education or creative writing. The fund had been named the Olivia Parker Scholarship for Literary Arts. Attached was a personal note from Eleanor. Olivia, this is not an attempt to purchase forgiveness or insinuate myself back into your life. It is simply a recognition that your values, the same ones we once dismissed, deserve to be perpetuated. The scholarship will help young people who, like you, have talent and determination that might otherwise be overlooked due to circumstances of birth or background. The funding comes from the sale of personal assets, not company resources. It is irrevocable and will continue regardless of our financial situation. I will understand if you wish the name to be changed. Please inform us if so. With respect and regret for past wrongs, Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, trying to process what it meant. This wasn't part of our agreement. It wasn't a condition I had imposed, or a requirement of the property purchase. It was, apparently, a voluntary act from a woman who had once dismissed everything I stood for. I called Professor Martinez for perspective. "What do you make of this?" I asked after explaining the situation. "Is it manipulation? A publicity stunt?" "It could be," Carmen acknowledged, "or it could be genuine growth. People can change, Olivia, especially when life humbles them. The question is, does their potential redemption arc matter to yours?" It was, as always, the right question. My healing journey wasn't dependent on the Whitfields' moral development. My worth wasn't validated by their recognition, even when that recognition took the form of a scholarship in my name. "I'm not sure it does," I said slowly. "I think I'm indifferent to their growth. I hope they're becoming better people, but not for my sake." "That's a powerful place to be," Carmen observed. "True freedom from their influence." I considered her words carefully. Was I truly free? When I thought about Eleanor and Peter, about Richard and the life I'd left behind, did I feel the grip of old pain or the lightness of release? The answer surprised me with its clarity. I felt neither hatred nor longing when I thought of the Whitfields now. They were characters in a chapter of my life that had ended, important to the overall narrative, but no longer central to the plot. "I think I'll allow the scholarship to keep my name," I told Carmen. "Not because I need the recognition, but because some student out there might see it and think, if Olivia Parker made it, maybe I can too." "That's a gift worth giving," Carmen agreed. Later that week, I sent a brief reply to Eleanor's note. "The scholarship may retain my name. Thank you for extending opportunities to students who might otherwise be overlooked. Olivia." No emotional declarations, no renewed connection, just acknowledgement of a positive action taken in the world. It felt like the right balance, neither coldly dismissive nor falsely warm. As the opening date for the Literacy Center approached, I found myself increasingly immersed in preparations. The space was transformed from a dusty upper floor of a historic building into a vibrant community hub with reading nooks, digital learning stations, and a small auditorium for author visits and educational events. I hired a director with extensive experience in literacy programs, giving her autonomy to shape the center's offerings while maintaining my vision of accessibility and excellence. We developed partnerships with local schools, particularly those serving vulnerable populations, and created a volunteer program that included retired teachers, college students, and community members passionate about education. Throughout this process, I remained conscious of the delicate balance required when bringing resources into communities that have historically been underserved. This wasn't about a wealthy savior swooping in with solutions. It was about creating space for voices and needs that had been systematically ignored, including by families like the Whitfields. The night before the grand opening, I stood alone in the nearly completed center, absorbing the quiet before the space would fill with voices and activity. On one wall hung framed first editions of beloved children's classics, carefully selected, to represent diverse perspectives and experiences. On another, a quotation from my grandmother was painted in flowing script. "Books are bridges to worlds we might otherwise never know." And there, near the entrance, was Eleanor's framed letter about the importance of educational opportunity. I had received the draft weeks earlier, expecting something perfunctory and impersonal. Instead, I'd found a thoughtful meditation on how access to education shapes not just individual futures, but community well-being. It acknowledged, without being explicitly political, the systemic inequities that limit potential, and the responsibility of those with resources to address these barriers. Reading it now, I wondered if Eleanor had written it herself or commissioned someone else to craft it. But certain phrases carried her distinctive voice, suggesting that whatever transformation she was undergoing might be genuine rather than performative. My phone chimed with a text from Megan. "All set for tomorrow? Need anything last minute?" "All good," I replied. "Just doing a final walkthrough. See you in the morning." As I prepared to leave, I noticed a small package on the reception desk. That hadn't been there earlier. It was wrapped in simple brown paper with my name written on top in familiar handwriting, Richards. I hesitated before opening it. Our limited communication since his apology call had been cordial but distant. What possible gift could he have felt appropriate to leave here, on the eve of such a significant event? Inside the package was a leather-bound journal with creamy, unlined pages. Tucked into the front cover was a note. "Olivia, you once told me that you wrote your first story in a notebook your grandmother gave you when you were 8. I thought perhaps another child visiting the center might find similar inspiration from these pages. No obligation to use them or acknowledge their source. Just a small contribution to a journey I wish I had supported properly from the beginning." It was, perhaps, the most thoughtful gift Richard had ever given me, one that demonstrated he had actually listened to my stories and remembered what mattered to me. The gesture touched me unexpectedly, a small but genuine tribute to the person I had always been beneath the projections and expectations of the Whitfield world. I placed the journal on a shelf in the children's area, alongside art supplies and blank paper for young visitors to use. No label, no attribution, just an invitation for someone to fill those pages with their own emerging voice. As I finally turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, a woman standing tall in a space she had created, surrounded by manifestations of her values and vision. 3 years ago, I had walked away from a Thanksgiving table, where I'd been told I was worthless. Now I stood amid tangible proof that the Whitfields had been wrong, not just about my potential for financial success, but about what constituted true value in the first place. The grand opening of the Helen Parker Literacy Center dawned bright and clear. I arrived early, wanting a few moments alone in the space before the crowds arrived. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting patterns across the polished wooden floors and illuminating the colorful children's area. Everything was ready. The books precisely arranged on shelves, the computer stations humming quietly, the welcome banners hung with care. Megan arrived next, arms full of fresh flowers for the reception area. "It's perfect, Liv," she said, taking in the transformed space. "Grandma would be over the moon." "I keep expecting to see her," I admitted, arranging a vase of sunflowers, her favorites, on the main desk. "She should be here for this." "She is," Megan said simply, squeezing my hand. "In every book, every reading nook, every detail you've insisted on getting just right." The center's director, Sophia Menendez, arrived with her team of staff and volunteers. A former literacy specialist with 20 years of experience in underserved schools, Sophia had been my first and only choice to run the center. She brought not just expertise, but genuine passion for connecting children with stories that could open worlds to them. The press is already gathering outside, she informed me. Local education reporter, city paper, and I think I spotted the cultural correspondent from the National Daily. I nodded, not entirely surprised by the media interest. The center's opening coincided with the growing buzz around my literary award nomination, creating a perfect storm of public attention. What had begun as a private resolution to the Whitfield's financial crisis had evolved into something with broader significance. A statement about the value of literacy, community, investment, and the power of redefining success. Remember, I want the focus on the programs, not me, I reminded Sophia. This isn't about my personal journey or connections. Understood, she assured me. Though your story is compelling, especially to young writers looking for role models. There will be time for that narrative later, I said. Today belongs to the community this center will serve. As the doors opened and guests began to arrive, I took a deep breath and stepped into my role as founder and visionary. Local officials arrived first, then educators from nearby schools, community advocates, and families eager to explore the new resource in their neighborhood. Children darted between book displays and interactive exhibits, while parents collected information about after-school programs and weekend workshops. I moved through the crowd, answering questions about the center's mission and programs. When asked about my motivation for founding it, I spoke about my grandmother's influence and the transformative power of literacy, carefully avoiding any mention of the Whitfields or the financial arrangement that had made the building purchase possible. An hour into the event, as I was demonstrating the digital story creation station to a group of middle schoolers, I felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. Looking up, I saw Eleanor and Peter Whitfield standing just inside the entrance, taking in the scene with expressions I couldn't quite read. They were impeccably dressed as always, but something about their demeanor had changed since our last meeting. They seemed less imposing somehow, less certain of their place in the hierarchy of the world. Peter surveyed the renovated space with the appraising eye of someone who appreciated quality craftsmanship, while Eleanor watched a volunteer reading to a circle of captivated children, an unfamiliar softness in her gaze. I excused myself from the demonstration and approached them, maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized our recent interactions. "Thank you for coming," I said, extending my hand to each of them in turn. "We wouldn't have missed it," Eleanor replied. "The transformation of the space is remarkable." "Your team has done exceptional work," Peter added, gesturing to the exposed brick walls and restored ceiling details. "They've honored the building's history while creating something entirely new." Their praise felt genuine, free from the condescension that had once colored their every interaction with me. Whether this represented true growth or simply the humbling effect of financial crisis, I couldn't say with certainty. But standing before them in a space that embodied everything they had once dismissed about me, I found myself oddly unburdened by the need to know their motives or measure their sincerity. "The children seem to love it already," Eleanor observed, watching as a young girl settled into a reading nook with one of the center's books. "That's the most important metric of success," I replied. "Not square footage or fixtures, but whether they feel welcome here." Eleanor nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between us. For all our differences, she recognized that I had created something of genuine value, not by the standards she had once tried to impose on me, but by measures that actually mattered. As the day progressed, I watched the center come alive with exactly the energy I had envisioned. Parents discussed educational resources with staff. Children discovered books that sparked their curiosity. Community members connected over shared interests in the adult reading section. The Whitfields moved discreetly through the space, observing but not inserting themselves, respectful of the fact that this was my moment, not theirs. Near the end of the event, as the crowd began to thin, I noticed a young girl sitting alone. In the children's area, Richard's journal open on her lap. She couldn't have been more than 10, with unruly curls and a serious expression as she carefully wrote in the blank pages. I approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt her concentration. "That's a special notebook," I said when she finally looked up. "It was just sitting on the shelf," she replied, suddenly worried. Was I not supposed to use it? "No, you're exactly the person who should be using it," I assured her. "What are you writing?" "A story about a girl who finds a magic library where the books talk to her," she explained, her initial concern giving way to enthusiasm. "The library helps her solve problems and stand up to bullies who say she's not smart enough." The parallel to my own experience was so striking that for a moment I couldn't respond. Here was a child I'd never met, writing a story that echoed my journey in ways she couldn't possibly understand. "That sounds like an amazing story," I finally managed. "What's your name?" "Maya," she replied. "I want to be a writer someday." "Like you. My teacher told us you write books." "I do," I confirmed. "And if you're writing stories already, it sounds like you're a writer too." Her face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Can I take this notebook home to finish my story?" "Absolutely," I told her. "It's yours now. A gift from someone who believes in the power of stories." As Maya carefully placed the journal in her backpack, promising to return next week to show me her completed story, I caught sight of Eleanor watching our interaction from across the room. For once, I didn't mind her witnessing this moment. Let her see what real worth looked like, not measured in financial success or social standing, but in the passing of inspiration from one generation to the next. The official closing of the property sale took place the following week in the sterile conference room of my attorney's office. Eleanor and Peter represented the Whitfield Group, accompanied by their legal counsel. The transaction was handled with professional efficiency, papers signed, checks exchanged, handshakes all around. What had begun as an unexpected plea for financial help had culminated in a clean business deal that served both parties' interests. As we prepared to leave, Eleanor handed me a small envelope. "This contains verification of our first donation to the Education Foundation," she explained, "as well as the establishing documents for the scholarship fund. Everything has been executed according to our agreement." "Thank you," I said, accepting the envelope. "I'll review them." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "Richard asked me to tell you he's taking a teaching position at the university. Modern literature, focusing on contemporary voices outside the traditional canon." The information surprised me. Richard had always seemed destined for the corporate trajectory his parents had mapped out for him. Law school, partnership at a prestigious firm, eventual succession to leadership of the family business. A teaching position represented a significant departure from that path. "That sounds like a good fit for him," I replied neutrally, though inwardly I was trying to reconcile this new information with the man I had known. "It is," Eleanor confirmed. "He's found something he genuinely cares about, rather than pursuing what was expected of him." The subtle acknowledgement of their role in pushing him toward unfulfilling choices hung in the air between us. "I'm glad," I said, and meant it. For all the pain of our failed marriage, I had never wished Richard unhappiness, only the courage to define his own path apart from his parents' expectations. It seemed he might finally be finding that courage, albeit years too late for us. Outside the building, as we prepared to go our separate ways, Peter cleared his throat awkwardly. "I wanted to tell you that we've read your books," he said. "Both of them. They're quite exceptional. The character development in particular is remarkable." Coming from Peter Whitfield, who had once dismissed fiction as glorified entertainment, unworthy of serious attention, this represented a seismic shift. Not just that he had read my novels, but that he had engaged with them thoughtfully enough to offer specific literary observation. "Thank you," I said simply, neither seeking nor needing more elaborate praise. We're looking forward to the third, Eleanor added, and to seeing what becomes of the award nomination. As their car pulled away, I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, absorbing the strange new reality that had emerged from the wreckage of our previous relationship. Not friendship, not reconciliation, but a cautious mutual respect that would have seemed impossible on that fateful Thanksgiving evening. My phone chimed with a text from my agent. Great news. Film rights inquiry from Major Studio for Book 2. Call me ASAP. Life moved forward, bringing new opportunities, challenges, and choices that had nothing to do with the Whitfields or their opinions of me. The liberation in that simple fact felt like its own form of wealth, the freedom to pursue my path without looking back for approval or validation. 6 months later, I stood on a stage in a grand hotel ballroom, accepting the literary award for which my second novel had been nominated. The citation praised my unflinching examination of identity, belonging, and the courage to define oneself outside the boundaries of others' expectations, words that felt almost too perfectly aligned with my personal journey. As I looked out at the audience of literary figures, critics, publishers, and readers, I saw Megan in the front row, tears streaming unabashedly down her face. Beside her sat Professor Martinez, beaming with proud satisfaction. These were the people who had truly seen me, who had recognized my worth when others had declared me worthless. My acceptance speech was brief, but heartfelt. I spoke about my grandmother's influence, about the power of stories to help us understand ourselves and others, about the Literacy Center and its mission to extend that power to children regardless of background or circumstance. I didn't mention the Whitfields or their role in either my pain or my subsequent triumph. They were part of my story, but they no longer defined it. At the reception afterward, as I chatted with fellow authors and industry professionals, a catering server approached, with a bottle of champagne and 5 crystal flutes on a silver tray. Compliments of the party at table 9, she explained, gesturing toward the back of the room. I followed her gaze to see Eleanor and Peter seated with Richard at a distant table. They raised their glasses in a silent toast when they caught my eye, not intruding on my moment, but acknowledging it from afar. The gesture was restrained, respectful of the boundaries I had established. I nodded my acknowledgement, then turned back to my conversation with a prominent book critic, letting the Whitfields remain in the periphery of my attention, just as they now existed in the periphery of my life. Later that evening, as I celebrated, with Megan and Carmen at my favorite restaurant, I received a text from Richard. Congratulations. The award is well-deserved recognition of extraordinary talent. Your grandmother would be immensely proud. I smiled faintly at the echo of his father's earlier message, wondering if Richard realized the parallel. After a moment's consideration, I typed a simple reply. Thank you. I hope you're finding fulfillment in your teaching. His response came quickly. I am. For the first time in my life, I'm doing work that matters to me rather than trying to meet someone else's definition of success. It struck me then, the symmetry of our journeys, both of us finally finding authentic paths after breaking free from expectations that had never truly fit. The difference was that I had had to fight my way out alone, while Richard had remained trapped until financial necessity had forced his parents to loosen their grip. That's worth celebrating, I replied. It is, he agreed, though I'm sorry it took losing you to start me on this path. I didn't respond to that last message. Some doors were better left closed, some chapters complete as written. Richard and I had both moved forward into lives that suited us better than the one we had tried to build together. That was enough. A year to the day after the Literacy Center opened, I received a large manila envelope in the mail. Inside was a bound collection of stories written by children who had participated in the center's programs. The accompanying note from Sophia explained that they had compiled the anthology as a surprise thank you gift, with proper permissions from parents and young authors alike. I spent the evening reading their stories, tales of adventure and mystery, family and friendship, courage and resilience. Some were just a few handwritten pages with crayon illustrations, others more sophisticated narratives that showed remarkable promise. All of them reflected the unique perspectives and voices of children who might otherwise have had no outlet for their creativity. Maya's story was included, expanded from her initial idea into a fully developed tale about a magical library where books spoke to readers who needed their wisdom most. She had dedicated it to Ms. Olivia, who gave me my first real writer's notebook and told me I already was a writer. The final page of the anthology contained photographs from the center's first year. Children engaged in reading and writing activities, community events, author visits, and educational programs. In one corner, almost easy to miss, was a small picture of the framed letter from Eleanor, with the caption, "Even those who once dismissed the power of words can learn to value them." I smiled at Sophia's subtle commentary. She knew enough of my history with the Whitfields to appreciate the irony of Eleanor's contribution to the center. But she also understood, as I did, that the letter's presence represented something important, not just about Eleanor's potential for growth, but about my own capacity to transform pain into purpose. That evening, I began writing a new novel, one about a woman who inherits an unexpected fortune and must decide how to use it in a way that honors her values rather than conforming to others' expectations. It wasn't autobiography disguised as fiction, but it drew on emotional truths I had lived: the complex nature of wealth, the power dynamics inherent in giving and receiving help, the challenge of defining success in authentic rather than conventional terms. As the story took shape beneath my fingers, I realized that my experience with the Whitfields had given me something valuable after all. Not their approval, which I no longer needed, but a deeper understanding of how money, power, and perception intertwine to shape lives and relationships. This insight informed not just my writing, but my decisions about how to use the increasing resources my success had brought me. The morning after completing the first draft of the new manuscript, I received an unexpected email from Eleanor. The subject line read simply, "An update and a question." "Olivia," she wrote, "I want to inform you that the first recipient of the scholarship bearing your name has been selected. A young woman from a rural community whose writing samples demonstrated extraordinary promise, but whose financial circumstances would have made university attendance nearly impossible without assistance. My question is whether you would consider meeting with her when she arrives on campus this fall. Peter and I will host a small reception for scholarship recipients, but she has specifically expressed interest in connecting with the writer whose name is on her funding package. I understand if you prefer to maintain distance from these events. The scholarship will continue regardless, as will our donations to the Education Foundation and support for the Literacy Center, which has become a model for similar initiatives in other communities. With continued respect, Eleanor." I sat with the email for a long while, considering my response. The old barriers of resentment and distrust had gradually eroded over the past year, replaced by a cautious professional relationship bounded by mutual interests in education and literacy. Was I ready to take a step towards something more personal? In the end, I decided that meeting the scholarship recipient wasn't about Eleanor or our complicated history. It was about supporting a young writer at the beginning of her journey, offering the kind of mentorship Professor Martinez had once extended to me when I most needed guidance. "I would be happy to meet with the scholarship recipient," I replied. "Please send details closer to the date. If convenient, I'd prefer to meet with her one-on-one before any formal reception." Eleanor's response was prompt and without embellishment. "Understood. I'll make the arrangements accordingly. Thank you." No effusive gratitude, no attempt to leverage my agreement into something more than it was. Just a simple acknowledgement that respected the boundaries I had established. It was, perhaps, the clearest evidence yet of how completely our dynamic had shifted. The following week brought another unexpected development. My agent called with news that the film adaptation of my second novel had secured financing and would begin production in the spring. "They want you as a consulting producer," she explained. "Full creative input, approval on major casting decisions, the works. It's an exceptional offer for a first adaptation." The opportunity was indeed extraordinary. A chance to see my story translated to a new medium while maintaining some control over how it would be interpreted. More than that, it represented another form of vindication against those who had once dismissed my writing as a hobby rather than a serious career. "I'll need to see the contract details," I told my agent. "But preliminarily, yes, I'm interested." As I hung up, I found myself thinking again about that Thanksgiving dinner. The contempt in Eleanor's voice as she'd called me a gold digger with a worthless degree. The silence from Richard as his mother had eviscerated his wife's ambitions. The quiet dignity with which I had finally walked away from a table where I was neither valued nor welcome. I couldn't have imagined then that 3 years later, I would be negotiating film rights to my award-winning novel, while the Whitfields faced financial ruin and turned to me for help. Nor could I have predicted that the resolution to that crisis would create something unexpectedly meaningful, not just for me, but for the community the Literacy Center served and the students the scholarship would support. Life had a strange way of inverting expectations, of transforming rejection into opportunity, of proving that true worth wasn't measured by others' assessments, but by the impact of one's choices and contributions. That evening, as autumn sunlight slanted through my apartment windows, I opened my laptop and began writing again. Not the novel this time, but a letter to the young woman who would receive the first Olivia Parker Scholarship for Literary Arts. I wanted her to understand that her talent had value regardless of whether others recognized it immediately. That perseverance in the face of dismissal wasn't just about proving critics wrong, but about honoring one's authentic voice and vision. That success, properly defined, meant creating work that reflected one's deepest values rather than conforming to external metrics of achievement. It was the letter I wish someone had written to me when I was starting out, before the Whitfields, before the publishing success, before I had learned through painful experience that self-worth couldn't be granted or revoked by others, only discovered and claimed by oneself. As I signed my name at the bottom, I felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The journey that had begun with rejection at a Thanksgiving table had led through pain and determination to a place of genuine security, not just financial, but emotional and creative. I had built something lasting, not just in my books or the Literacy Center, but in the clarity with which I now moved through the world, unencumbered by others' judgments or expectations. The Whitfields had called me worthless, then begged for help when my inheritance arrived. But the true inheritance hadn't been the money itself. It had been the wisdom to use it in alignment with my deepest values, the strength to maintain boundaries, even while extending help, and the understanding that worth was never something others could bestow or withhold, only something I could recognize and honor in myself. That knowledge was the most valuable gift of all, one that no financial crisis could threaten and no external validation could enhance. It was mine, hard-won and permanent. And in sharing it through my writing, my philanthropy, and my mentorship of young voices like Maya and the scholarship recipient, I was creating a different kind of inheritance, one that would outlast any fortune and transcend the limitations of others' perceptions. As night fell over the city, I closed my laptop and stood at the window, gazing out at the lights twinkling below. Somewhere out there, a child was writing in a journal that had once been a gesture of Richard's belated understanding. Somewhere, a student was preparing for college opportunities that wouldn't have existed without Eleanor's unexpected evolution. And somewhere, readers were finding recognition and resonance in stories born of my determination to define success on my own terms. These ripple effects, extending outward from choices made in the aftermath of rejection, were the true measure of what I had built. Not to prove the Whitfields wrong, though I had certainly done that, but to create meaning aligned with my authentic self. The woman they had called worthless had transformed that judgment into something of immeasurable value. And in doing so, I had written an ending to our story that none of us could have predicted. One where pain became purpose, rejection became redirection, and an inheritance became not just financial security, but a legacy of empowerment that would continue long after the money itself was gone. Interesting, I said neutrally. Now, about your magical library series, I think the third story is the strongest yet, but I have some thoughts about how you might develop the character of the librarian. After Maya left, her observation about Richard lingered in my mind. That he would use my work in his teaching made professional sense, but the depth of his engagement with it suggested something I hadn't anticipated, a genuine literary respect that had developed independently of our personal history. As winter gradually yielded to spring, my involvement with the Whitfield Education Foundation deepened. What had begun as a consultation about their writer-in-residence program evolved into regular advisory meetings, where my experience as both educator and author proved unexpectedly valuable to their expanding literacy initiatives. During one such meeting in early April, held in a sleek conference room at the Foundation's downtown offices, I found myself engaged in spirited debate with Eleanor about resource allocation. Bringing established authors into schools creates inspirational moments, she argued, which could spark lifelong literary interest in students who might not otherwise consider writing as a viable path. I don't disagree, I countered, but those momentary inspirations need sustainable support. A one-day visit from a successful writer means little without ongoing mentorship, access to resources, and structural opportunities to develop talent. Peter, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. You're suggesting we need both, the spark and the sustained flame. Exactly, I confirmed. The writer visits are valuable, but they should be paired with something more enduring. Funding. For school literary magazines, year-round writing groups led by local authors, scholarships for summer workshops, accessible publishing platforms. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, making notes in the leather-bound portfolio she still carried to all meetings, a habit I remembered from my days as Richard's wife. This is precisely why we wanted your perspective, Olivia. We can secure the funding, but you understand the actual needs of developing writers. The exchange exemplified our new dynamic, professional allies focused on shared goals rather than personal history. Eleanor still dressed impeccably, still maintained her composed exterior, still approached problems with the strategic mindset of a woman accustomed to influence. But the contempt that had once colored her interactions with me had been replaced by something approaching respect. After the meeting concluded, as I gathered my materials to leave, Peter approached me with an unexpected question. The Literacy Center has been such a success that we're considering replicating the model in other neighborhoods, he said. Would you be amenable to having your grandmother's name on these new centers as well? The Helen Parker Literacy Network has a certain resonance. The question caught me off guard. My grandmother's name on the original center had been deeply personal, a tribute to the woman who had first nurtured my love of literature and recognized my potential as a writer. Extending that naming to other locations felt different somehow, raising questions about legacy, ownership, and the complicated history between my family and the Whitfields. I'd need to think about that, I replied honestly. My grandmother's influence on my life was profound and specific. Using her name more broadly would require careful consideration. Peter nodded, accepting this boundary without pushback. Another small indication of how our relationship had evolved. Of course, it's a meaningful decision. We just thought there might be value in connecting these spaces under a unified identity that honors educational empowerment. I appreciate the thought behind it, I said. Let me reflect on it and get back to you. As I left the foundation offices, I found myself contemplating how thoroughly the power dynamic between us had shifted. 3 years ago, I had walked away from the Whitfield's Thanksgiving table, devastated by their judgment but determined to forge my own path. Now they were seeking my approval, my expertise, even permission to use my family name in their philanthropy. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they had deemed worthless had become someone whose association added value to their endeavors. But more striking than the irony was the realization that this evolution hadn't happened through vindictiveness or retribution, but through authentic growth on all sides. I hadn't set out to prove the Whitfields wrong or force them to recognize my worth. I had simply focused on building a life aligned with my values, developing my talents, and creating meaningful work. Their eventual recognition had come not because I had demanded it, but because circumstances had humbled them enough to see what had always been there. That evening, I called Megan to discuss the naming question. "They want to use Grandma's name on multiple centers?" she asked, her initial skepticism obvious. "That feels, I don't know, like they're co-opting our family legacy." That was my first reaction too, I admitted. But their literacy work has been genuinely impactful. The original center has served thousands of children, created jobs for educators, and become a community anchor. If they're replicating that model elsewhere. It's still complicated, Megan pointed out. Grandma would have loved what the center does, but she never knew the Whitfields, never experienced how they treated you. True, I acknowledged. Though I wonder if that even matters anymore. The centers aren't about the Whitfields or me or our history. They're about the children who need access to books and mentorship and safe spaces to develop their creativity. Megan was quiet for a moment. "You've really moved past it all, haven't you? Not just in a I'm over it way, but in a deeper sense. They don't have power over how you see yourself anymore." Her observation struck me with its accuracy. The Whitfields' opinions, their approval or disapproval, their recognition or dismissal, no longer carried emotional weight for me. They had become simply people with whom I had complicated history, but currently productive professional relationships. "I guess I have," I replied. "Not through some dramatic forgiveness moment, but gradually, by building something meaningful that validates itself." "Then I think you have your answer about Grandma's name," Megan said softly. "If it serves the work you believe in, and if you're engaging from a place of strength rather than seeking validation, maybe extending her legacy this way honors her more than keeping it limited to one location." After our call, I sat at my desk by the window, watching darkness settle over the university campus. My grandmother had been a public school teacher for 40 years, dedicated to expanding children's worlds through literature long before terms. Like literacy access became philanthropic buzzwords. Would she have wanted her name associated with multiple centers founded by a family that had once rejected her granddaughter so thoroughly? Perhaps the question itself was too narrowly framed. My grandmother had cared less about recognition than impact, less about who received credit than whether children received opportunity. The Helen Parker Literacy Network, whatever its complicated origins, would embody values she had lived by. Values I had carried forward in my own work as both teacher and writer. The next morning, I emailed Peter with my decision. I would allow my grandmother's name to be used for the expanded network of centers, with certain conditions regarding program, quality, community involvement, and ongoing evaluation. The Whitfield Education Foundation could provide funding and infrastructure, but the centers themselves would be governed by educators and community representatives who understood local needs. Peter's response came quickly: agreement to all, conditions, gratitude for the partnership, and a request to include me in the planning committee for the network's expansion. It was a respectful acknowledgement of both my professional expertise and personal connection to the project, neither presumptuous nor disengaged. As spring semester progressed toward its conclusion, my thoughts increasingly turned toward what would come after my year at Brookfield. The visiting position had been everything I'd hoped for professionally: stimulating students, supportive colleagues, space to develop my new novel while contributing meaningfully to emerging writers' development. But it had also provided unexpected personal resolution through my evolving interactions with the Whitfields. The question now was whether to return to my previous life in the city where I'd rebuilt after my divorce, or consider other possibilities. Perhaps extending at Brookfield if they offered, exploring different academic positions, or focusing exclusively on writing for a period. My fourth novel was taking shape with surprising momentum, exploring themes of reinvention and reconnection through the story of a woman who returns to her hometown after years of estrangement, only to discover that both she and the place she'd fled had transformed in ways neither could have anticipated. The parallels to my own experience weren't lost on me, though my protagonist's journey diverged significantly from mine. Fiction allowed for exploration of alternative pathways, emotional landscapes I hadn't traversed directly, but could imagine with empathetic precision. One evening in late April, as I was working late in my office, a knock at the door interrupted my writing flow. I looked up to find Richard standing in the doorway, a stack of papers in hand. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, maintaining a respectful distance. "Catherine asked me to drop off these applications for the summer writing workshop. Apparently, they need faculty evaluations by next week." "Thanks," I replied, accepting the papers. "I'll review them tomorrow." Richard nodded, then hesitated before adding, "Your lamp looks right at home there." I glanced at the wooden desk lamp he'd given me, now positioned perfectly beside my computer. It's been extremely useful, especially during winter when darkness came so early. "I'm glad," he said simply, then turned to leave before pausing again. "I heard about the literacy network expansion. It's a fitting tribute to your grandmother's legacy." "I hope so," I acknowledged. "The original center has exceeded all expectations in terms of community impact." Richard smiled slightly. "Not surprising, given its origins. You've always had clearer vision about what matters than the rest of us." The comment wasn't flirtatious or nostalgic, but a straightforward acknowledgement of a truth we both recognized. In our marriage, I had often seen possibilities beyond conventional success metrics, possibilities Richard had only begun to value after our relationship ended and his parents' financial crisis forced reevaluation of priorities. Better late than never, I replied neutrally. "Indeed," he agreed, meeting my gaze directly. "For what it's worth, my students have found tremendous value in your seminars this year. Several have mentioned that your approach to authentic voice has transformed their writing practice." "That's gratifying to hear," I said sincerely. "They're a talented group." After Richard left, I returned to my manuscript, but found my concentration broken by thoughts of our brief interaction. There had been nothing inappropriate or boundary-crossing about it, just a collegial exchange between faculty members with shared history and current professional respect. Yet it highlighted something significant. Richard had changed in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. He had found his own authentic voice as both teacher and person, separate from his parents' expectations and the performance of the perfect son I had witnessed during our marriage. I wondered whether that evolution would have been possible if we had stayed together, if the financial crisis that had humbled the Whitfields would have created the same opening for growth in Richard if he had still been playing the role of dutiful husband and son. Some transformations, it seemed, required the complete dismantling of existing structures to make space for new configurations. The thought wasn't painful or regretful, just contemplative, an acknowledgement that ending our marriage had ultimately served us both, allowing each to develop into more authentic versions of ourselves than our relationship had permitted. As the academic year drew to a close, I received 2 significant communications on the same day. The first was an email from Brookfield's dean offering to extend my distinguished visiting writer position for a second year, with potential for conversion to a permanent faculty role thereafter. The second was a call from my agent, informing me that the film adaptation of my second novel had secured full financing and was scheduled to begin production in the fall, with the acclaimed director still attached and a respected screenwriter completing the adaptation. Both opportunities represented professional validation beyond anything I could have imagined when I walked away from the Whitfield's Thanksgiving table 3 years earlier. Both would require careful consideration of practical logistics and personal priorities. Both reflected the extraordinary distance I had traveled from that moment of rejection to my current position of choice and agency. As I weighed these options, a third possibility crystallized in my mind, one that would require courage and creativity, but might allow me to honor multiple aspects of my professional identity while creating something uniquely valuable. I scheduled meetings with Catherine Chen and the dean to discuss an alternative to their generous offer. Rather than continuing as a full-time visiting faculty member, I proposed dividing my time between Brookfield and the expanding literacy network, teaching one seminar per semester while developing curriculum and mentorship programs for the community centers. This hybrid role would allow me to maintain connection with serious student writers at the university level while extending educational opportunity to children and teenagers from underserved communities. It would enable me to honor academic excellence while addressing systemic inequities in literary access. It would keep me engaged with both theory and practice, both privilege and need. To my surprise and gratification, Brookfield embraced the proposal enthusiastically. The dean saw potential for innovative university-community partnership. Catherine recognized opportunity for English department outreach, and the Whitfield Education Foundation readily agreed to fund the position's community-facing aspects. The BTAS arrangement would require careful balancing of responsibilities, strategic time management, and clear boundaries. But it would also create unique opportunities for cross-pollination, bringing community voices into academic spaces, extending university resources to neighborhood centers, building bridges between worlds that too often remained separate. As news of this unprecedented position spread through academic and philanthropic circles, I received an unexpected email from Eleanor. Your innovative approach to this joint appointment exemplifies exactly what education should be, breaking down artificial barriers between knowledge spaces to create something more inclusive and impactful. The Foundation Board is unanimously supportive. On a personal note, I find myself reflecting often on how thoroughly you have proven my Thanksgiving assessment wrong. Worthless may be the single most inaccurate judgment I have ever voiced. The irony that our family's legacy may ultimately be defined more by your vision than our resources is not lost on me. With respect, Eleanor. It was perhaps the closest thing to a direct apology Eleanor would ever offer, an explicit acknowledgement of her grievous mischaracterization of my worth and potential impact. 3 years ago, such validation would have felt monumental, healing even. Now it registered as a footnote in a much larger story, meaningful but not defining. The woman who had walked away from that Thanksgiving table had needed external confirmation of her value, had burned with determination to prove her worth through achievement and recognition. The woman I had become recognized worth as inherent rather than externally conferred, measured impact by contribution rather than accolades, and defined success by alignment with authentic purpose rather than others' assessments. It wasn't that achievements didn't matter. The literary award, the film adaptation, the academic position, the community impact all represented meaningful manifestations of my talents and efforts. But they no longer served as protective armor against others' dismissal or essential validation of my existence. They were expressions of purpose rather than proof of worth. In early June, I received a formal invitation to the Whitfield Foundation's annual gala, a black tie fundraiser that had once been among the most prestigious social events in the city. During my marriage to Richard, I had attended 3 such galas, each time feeling like an uncomfortable imposter among the city's elite. my creative aspirations an awkward misfit amid conversations about investments, acquisitions, and status. Markers. This invitation felt different, not just because I would attend as a respected professional partner rather than an inadequate wife, but because the gala itself had transformed. The event description emphasized educational equity and community impact rather than merely celebrating wealth and influence. The beneficiaries would be the expanding literacy network and related educational initiatives rather than the vague cultural enrichment of previous years. After some consideration, I decided to accept the invitation. My presence would lend support to programs I believed in, and attending as my authentic self, award-winning author, respected educator, literacy advocate, would represent a fitting closure to this chapter of my relationship with the Whitfields. The gala fell on a warm Saturday evening in late June. I chose a simple but elegant navy gown, professional yet festive, and arrived at the historic downtown hotel with calm self-possession. That contrasted sharply with the anxiety I'd felt at these events during my marriage. The ballroom was transformed from previous years, still elegant with crystal chandeliers and floral arrangements, but now featuring displays about the literacy centers, artwork from student participants, and informational stations about educational initiatives rather than merely showcasing luxury and exclusivity. Eleanor spotted me shortly after my arrival, making her way across the room with the practiced social grace that had intimidated me years ago, but now registered simply as a skill, set, neither admirable nor off-putting, just part of who she was. "Olivia, thank you for coming," she greeted me, extending her hand. "Your presence means a great deal, especially to the center directors who are eager to meet the founder of the original location." "The network is doing important work," I replied. "I'm pleased to support it." Eleanor nodded, then gestured toward a quiet corner of the room. "If you have a moment, there's someone I'd like you to meet." I followed her to where a distinguished older woman in a deep burgundy suit stood observing the crowd. "Olivia, this is Madeline Westbrook, chair of the National Literacy Foundation. Madeline Olivia Parker, the force behind our literacy center. Model and author of The Unwritten Rules," Madeline finished, her eyes lighting with recognition. "I just finished your second novel last month. Extraordinary work. The way you handle intergenerational trauma through those parallel narrative structures is masterful." The conversation that followed was deeply engaging. A discussion of literacy, access, literary innovation, and the intersection of creative writing with social impact. Madeline expressed interest in potentially scaling the Helen Parker Literacy Network model to other cities, creating a national framework for community-based literary education. "We should continue this conversation," she concluded, handing me her card. "The foundation is looking for innovative models that bridge creative excellence with educational equity, and your work embodies that intersection perfectly." As she moved on to greet other guests, Eleanor remained beside me, an unreadable expression on her face. "The National Literacy Foundation's endorsement could transform the network's reach," she observed. "Madeline rarely expresses such immediate enthusiasm." Her perspective on literacy as both art and access aligns with the center's philosophy, I acknowledged. Eleanor hesitated, then said quietly, 3 years ago, I would have viewed her interest as validation of our foundation's prestige rather than recognition of the work's inherent value. Richard calls it my status metric worldview, measuring everything by how it positions us socially rather than what it contributes meaningfully. The candid self-assessment surprised me. That's an insightful observation. One of many painful recognitions that emerged from our financial crisis, Eleanor admitted, though perhaps less painful than realizing how thoroughly I misjudged you and your potential impact. Before I could respond, we were joined by Peter, who had been speaking with major donors across the room. "The Hendersons have committed to funding the Eastside Literacy Center," he announced, satisfaction evident in his voice. "That completes our initial phase of network expansion." "Excellent news," Eleanor replied. Olivia was just meeting Madeline Westbrook, who expressed interest in potentially scaling our model nationally. Peter's eyebrows rose appreciatively. That would be extraordinary. The impact could be truly significant. As they discussed logistical implications of national expansion, I observed the subtle but profound shift in their priorities. The Peter and Eleanor Whitfield who had dismissed my career as worthless at that Thanksgiving dinner had valued prestige over purpose, status over substance, appearance over impact. The people before me now, while still unmistakably part of the social elite, had discovered something about meaningful contribution that had eluded them during prosperity. I excused myself to speak with Sophia, who was introducing center staff to potential donors across the room. As I moved through the crowd, I caught sight of Richard in conversation with the university president near the bar. He nodded politely when our eyes met, but made no move to approach, maintaining the professional boundaries that had characterized our interaction throughout the academic year. The evening continued with speeches celebrating the literacy network's early success and outlining ambitious plans for expansion. When Peter acknowledged my contribution as the original center's visionary, the applause was generous and genuine. 3 years ago, I would have craved such recognition as validation of my worth. Tonight, I accepted it as acknowledgement of work I valued, neither more nor less significant than the contributions of teachers, staff, and community members who had brought the centers to life. As the formal program concluded and guests mingled, over dessert and coffee, Richard approached, maintaining a respectful distance that signaled his awareness of appropriate boundaries. "Congratulations on what you've built," he said simply. Few could have transformed an initially transactional arrangement into something with such profound impact. "The centers have exceeded my expectations," I acknowledged. "Your vision for the university community partnership is equally impressive," Richard continued. "Catherine says your proposal has inspired several other departments to consider similar outreach initiatives." "That's gratifying to hear," I replied. "Cross-institutional collaboration has such potential for addressing educational inequities." Richard nodded, then added quietly, "I've been meaning to tell you. I read the advance copy of your third novel. Your editor shared it when I interviewed her for my department's podcast series. This surprised me. My third novel wouldn't be published for another 2 months, and advance copies were limited to reviewers and industry professionals. That Richard had not only obtained one, but actually read it, represented a level of engagement with my work. Wouldn't have expected. "What did you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response as both former husband and current literature professor. "It's your most accomplished work yet," he said thoughtfully. The protagonist's journey from external validation to self-definition reads as both universally relatable and deeply specific. I particularly admired the structural choices in the middle section, the way time compresses and expands to mirror her evolving self-perception. His analysis was precise and perceptive, engaging with the craft aspects I had wrestled with most deliberately during composition. It was the response of a serious reader who had approached the text with careful attention rather than obligatory interest. "Thank you," I said simply. The narrative structure evolved considerably during revision. "It shows that care," Richard affirmed. "My advanced seminar on contemporary fiction includes your first novel next semester. With your permission, I'd like to add this one to the syllabus once it's published." "Of course," I agreed. "I'd be interested to hear your students' responses to both works." Our conversation was interrupted by the university chancellor, who wanted to introduce Richard to a potential department donor. As he excused himself, I realized that this interaction, like all our exchanges over the past year, had maintained a delicate balance, acknowledging our shared history without presuming upon it, expressing genuine appreciation without crossing into nostalgia or regret. The Richard who had once been unable to defend me against his parents' judgment, who had allowed their disapproval to poison our marriage, had evolved into someone capable of recognizing value independently, of engaging thoughtfully with ideas and creations on their own merits. Whether that evolution had come through therapy as he'd claimed, through the humbling experience of financial crisis, or simply through the consequences of choices, I couldn't say with certainty. But it made my continued professional interaction with him less complicated than I had initially feared. As the gala concluded and guests began to depart, I found myself in a quiet moment of reflection near the display featuring photographs from the literacy centers. The images showed children engaged in reading and writing activities, teenagers participating in creative workshops, parents attending literacy classes with their young ones, tangible evidence of the network's impact on real lives. Eleanor approached, standing beside me to view the display. When we established the foundation years ago, it was primarily a tax strategy and social positioning tool, she admitted after a moment's silence. The philanthropy was real but peripheral to our main concerns: wealth preservation and status enhancement. I said nothing, allowing her the space to continue her unexpected candor. The financial crisis forced reconsideration of many things, she went on. Not just practical matters of assets and investments, but more fundamental questions of purpose and legacy. What would remain of value if the Whitfield name no longer carried financial weight? The question seemed rhetorical, but I offered a response nonetheless. Impact outlasts influence. Contribution endures after capital dissipates. Eleanor nodded slowly. Precisely what we've come to understand, however belatedly. The literacy network may be the most meaningful thing our family name becomes associated with, not because of the dollars donated, but because of the vision behind it. Your vision, ironically enough. The acknowledgement was delivered without defensiveness or resentment, just straightforward recognition of a truth we both understood. The woman they had once deemed worthless had ultimately defined the most valuable aspect of their legacy. Legacy is collaborative, I observed, gesturing to the photographs. These centers work because dedicated educators, engaged community members, and committed students bring them to life every day. My initial concept was just a starting point. Graciously put, Eleanor said, a hint of something like respect in her expression. But we both know the Whitfield connection would mean little without the Parker philosophy infusing these spaces. My Thanksgiving assessment wasn't just cruel, it was profoundly mistaken. It was the most direct acknowledgement she had ever made of that painful evening. The closest thing to an actual apology I would likely receive. 3 years ago, I would have craved such validation, would have felt vindicated by her admission of error. Now, it registered as a footnote to a journey that had never really been about proving her wrong, a journey that had instead led me to discover intrinsic worth, independent of others' assessments. We all make mistaken judgments, I said simply. What matters is the willingness to recognize them. As I gathered my things to leave, I paused for one last look at the gala room, the space where the city's elite had once gathered primarily to celebrate wealth and influence, now transformed into a venue for advancing educational equity. The change seemed symbolic of larger shifts, both in the Whitfield's priorities and in my own relationship to them. The woman who had fled their Thanksgiving table in tears had been defined largely by their rejection, motivated by determination to prove them wrong. The woman who departed their gala with quiet confidence was defined by her own choices and contributions, connected to them now through shared values rather than painful history. Outside, the summer night was warm and fragrant with blooming flowers. I declined the valet's offer to hail a taxi, choosing instead to walk the few blocks to my faculty apartment, enjoying the city's quiet beauty after dark. As I strolled past illuminated storefronts and historic buildings, I reflected on the journey that had brought me full circle to this place I had once fled. 3 years ago, leaving had been necessary, a vital act of self-preservation and determination to forge my own path away from the Whitfield's toxic judgment. Now, returning had provided unexpected resolution, not through dramatic confrontation or explicit forgiveness, but through the quiet evidence of how thoroughly we had all evolved since that painful Thanksgiving evening. The Whitfields had called me worthless, then begged for my help when financial crisis struck. I had provided that help not from vindictiveness or superiority, but from a place of authentic values and clear-eyed assessment of potential impact. What had begun as a transactional arrangement to address their immediate need had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated, a collaborative legacy of educational opportunity that transcended our complicated personal history. As I reached my apartment building, my phone chimed with a text message from Megan. "How was the gala? Did the Whitfields grovel appropriately before your magnificence?" I smiled at her protective loyalty, which remained fierce despite all evidence of the Whitfields' evolution. "No groveling required," I texted back. "Just unexpected closure." "Closure sounds suspiciously like forgiveness," Megan replied immediately. "Not exactly," I responded thoughtfully. "More like transcendence. Their judgment stopped mattering long ago. Tonight just confirmed that fact." Inside my apartment, I kicked off my heels and made a cup of tea, settling by the window to watch the city lights. On my desk lay the contract for my hybrid university community position, the manuscript for my 4th novel, notes for next semester's seminar, and plans for the Literacy Network's expansion. Tangible evidence of a life built on authentic purpose rather than others' approval. The Whitfields had called me worthless because they couldn't see beyond narrow definitions of success and value. Their subsequent financial crisis had forced recognition of what truly mattered, while my own journey had led to understanding worth as inherent rather than conferred, to measuring success by alignment with purpose rather than external metrics. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they had dismissed had ultimately helped define their most meaningful legacy. The path they had deemed worthless had led to impact neither of us could have foreseen that painful Thanksgiving night. But the most profound transformation hadn't been in their perception of my value, or even in the Literacy Network's expanding influence. It had been in my own understanding of worth as something neither the Whitfields nor anyone else could bestow or withhold. Something that existed independently of others' assessments, expressed through choices aligned with authentic values. That understanding was perhaps the most valuable inheritance of all, one that couldn't be quantified in dollars or measured in accolades, but that informed every aspect of the life I had built and would continue building, chapter by chapter, choice by choice, day by day. The woman who had once desperately needed the Whitfields' approval had become someone who recognized her intrinsic value, who measured success by contribution rather than recognition, who defined worth through authentic purpose rather than external validation. That woman, Professor Parker, award-winning author, literacy advocate, mentor to young writers, sat peacefully by her window, contemplating not the painful rejection that had once defined her, but the meaningful work that now filled her days, and the authentic path that continued to unfold before her, limitless with possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.